for having us.
Thank you. I'm going to kick off a tiny little bit to talk about the book, and then we're just going to have a chat, basically, which is rather nice. I collected stamps when I was a boy, as I suspect you did as well. And then I sort of, the next thing that happened, I had a very, very mediocre collection when I was young. You used to get these little packets of stamps, mainly lots of them from communist countries with astronauts on and things like that, and a few British ones. It was a very, very mediocre stamp collection indeed. But I had a lovely old uncle. We used to go and have tea with him on Sunday afternoons. Some Sundays, not every one. And one day I blurted out that I collected stamps, and he said, "Oh, I used to do that when I was a boy. I still got my album somewhere." And he wandered off, and he came back with this, which is a lovely Lincoln stamp album. Lincoln as in the town rather than the president, I think. It is a genuine Edwardian album, lovely sort of binding on it, and full of stamps from all around the world, from the late 19th and very early 20th century. Lots of Queen Victoria, lots of Edward VII, and nothing since then. So I looked through this, I was gobsmacked by it, and he said, "Oh, well, I don't really look at it any longer. Why didn't you have it?" So I did. I said, "Thank you very much." And I became a sort of proper stamp collector at that moment. A slight mishap happened when I took the album to school to show some friends, and this was obviously overseen by somebody else who wasn't a friend, because half the British stamps then disappeared. It rather put me off the collecting. But I persevered for a bit, and then adolescence kicked in, rock and roll, all that sort of stuff, and the album went up to the attic in my parents' house and sat there gathering dust for about 40 years. And then when my dad passed away, I was going through the attic, tearing it out, and I came across this. I thought, wow, this is interesting. What's in it? I looked through it, came to the Great Britain page, nothing there. I thought, well, I'm going to start collecting them again. I'm going to get the collection back. So I bought one of these Stanley Gibbons catalogues and looked at the prices of the stamps and thought, no, I won't. I'll just burn £5 notes in my back garden. It might be more fun. But then I discovered eBay and got on there and started collecting. Tried to get an example of every British stamp from the penny black, obviously up until 1971. When the decimalisation came in, and the sort of number of stamp issues mushroomed around that time in Britain. I think in America it had happened earlier. You'd already had this sort of massive issues. Around about 71, that's when it started here. So, I was collecting. Please come and sit down, sir. I've been telling a little story of this Lincoln stamp album, which I got from my lovely great uncle, bless him, and how somebody nicked half the stamps from it. As happens in life. Anyway, I started collecting again, and I became fascinated by the stamps for various reasons. And one of them was the actual design and the history of design and how you see what is considered beautiful changes over the years. And the difference between, I don't know, a rather cluttered Victorian stamp and a very modernist Edward VIII stamp. And then you get another. And you kind of go back to, after the war, you get this sort of longing for an older age, and the stamps clutter up again, and then they declutter again, back with the Machins. It's this sort of funny sort of ebb and flow of clutter in stamps, which I think says a lot about the psyche of the nation. And I just became interested in what it is that, you know, what's the story of these stamps? Each one of these little bits of paper is a little rectangular time machine to take you back into bygone era. It says a lot about how the nation saw itself, or at least how some people in the nation wanted the nation to be seen. And of course also they tell a personal story. So they're very public, they're a statement of national identity. At the same time they're also incredibly private, because they'd be stuck on an envelope, somebody stuck them on an envelope, put them in the post. What was inside that envelope? Now, it might have been something terribly dull. I've got a thing here from America, sent to, I think, probably a great aunt or something. And all it basically says, "It's very cold here in Chicago." That's all it says. Not hugely exciting, but other things would have had love letters in, all kinds of stuff. there's this funny kind of duality to stamps. There's a big picture and a little picture, and I just found that fascinating. So I filled my stamp album partially with stamps, but also with stuff about history. And then I thought, well, why don't I turn it into a book? I've half written it anyhow. So just a little bit more research, and I got a book. So I did, and my wonderful publishers here in the US, Picador, have picked it up. Thank you, Stephen. And here it is, all ready to go. History of Britain in 36 postage stamps. Looks absolutely lovely, beautifully set out. Pictures of all the stamps in there. Choosing 36 was quite difficult. I sort of just thought 36 is a nice number. It's 6 squared. It's just a nice, sensible number. Too many went over the top. 12 or something, you couldn't do enough storytelling. So I sort of whittled it down to about 40, and then it got difficult, and I had to get rid of some favourites. The 1951 Festival of Britain, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful stamps, but I'd got enough stuff about the 50s, so that went. Some other Victorian ones I didn't have enough place for. So in the end, we ended up with these chosen 36, and I'm very happy with them. I hope they are telling the story of the nation, starting off, of course, with the penny black, Rowland Hill, amazing man, great social entrepreneur. One of the links, you are an entrepreneur, James, but Rowland Hill was also an entrepreneur, but a social entrepreneur. He created an institution in society, and he did what an entrepreneur would have done. He had the idea, and he thought it through at a very deep level. How's it going to work? What's going to go wrong? How can I get round that? And then he had to fight like hell to make it work, because he had a lot of opposition. There was a splendid old boy called Colonel W.L. Maberly, who said something like, "This is the most preposterous idea I've ever heard of." So, and Maberly was a senior guy. He was a secretary to the post office, I think, a senior man. So he met a lot of opposition, and the actual story of how Victorian society sort of divided, and people from the mechanics institutes, the more entrepreneurial, the more forward-looking people said, no, this is a good idea. Penny post was born. Of course, 1847, same idea took root over here in the US, and it flourished everywhere. It's one of the great pieces of social entrepreneurship, I think. So stamps do tell wonderful stories, I think. Anyone, when you've got your collections, I know whether have you bought any stamps along? I can have a look at these. They all tell stories, marvellous stories they tell. That's really what my book is about. Great fun to write. I had to do a bit of research to sort of get my thoughts in order. I found out there was a lot of stuff I didn't know about my own country's history, which I thought I did, which is very good. And now here it is.
Well, where were you researching primarily?
I'm afraid I was using the internet mainly, and I did a talk in Cumbria, and there was a guy, I can't remember his name now, a Cambridge professor of history who had written a very good book. He gave a wonderful talk on the causes of the First World War, and we were talking about research, and he said, yes, I use Wikipedia, everybody does, and don't believe anyone who says they don't. So yes, I did use the internet a lot. You've just got to check. You see something on there, you check it.
Yeah.
But it's a very good source for stuff. It's a wonderful resource.
Are there other sources that have written about stamps as focused on stamps as historical documents?
Well, I've not seen anything. There's a very good history of the British Post Office, which came out a couple of years ago. It's quite meticulous. I think he goes on a little bit too much about the relationship with the trades unions in the 70s and things like that. And it's called Masters of the Post. And I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it now. It's a big, thick volume, very, very, very scholarly. But again, it's quite readable. It's not appallingly dense. That's a very good book on the history of the post. But I've not really seen anything which does what this book has done, really. I kind of looked around to see if anyone else was doing the same thing, and with a certain amount of relief found they weren't. So it was nice to know I had a clear run at the field.
That's great. Well, just to introduce myself briefly, and then I'll give it back to you. my name is James Hirschfeld. I'm the founder of a company called Paperless Post, which is a web and mobile application that I created when I started to work on when I was a junior at Harvard, because I saw that communication was moving away from paper and the traditional posts, and in the course of my lifetime had been digitized from casual sort of chatting to business correspondence. A lot had moved online, and the one last piece of communication that hadn't been successfully brought to the web was the kind of communication that happens around sort of important events in people's lives, like weddings and births and anniversary parties and stuff like that. So with my sister, I created a company which was an application that allowed consumers to design personal correspondence online that they could send via email, and it's called Paperless Post. Post being suggesting that it's a method of delivery, and a big part of the fabric of our product and the metaphor of our product and the reason why it's used and the reason why people pay for it. It ties back to the idea of messages, the physicality of messages being material objects with object quality, as well as language, and what the idea that the way that you say something and the way that it's packaged and delivered can often be as meaningful as the message itself. If you write "I love you" on a typewriter, you read it differently than if you write it out by hand, and you read it differently if you write it out on an engraved invitation. The same message can mean something different. And so a lot of what we do is package messages in a era when physicality is being called into question at every turn, and package it through sort of metaphor and symbols. So I actually have a similar early history with stamps. I was a stamp collector as well. My grandfather was. I also had my own paltry collection until my grandfather gave it a boost with his own collection, which was much more formidable. I was also a coin collector. I don't know if those two things are usually they go hand in hand.
Quite often do.
Yeah. And obviously there are some real similarities in terms of the historicity and the sort of authenticity. But I was always interested in stamps from an aesthetic perspective. I am a true dilettante. I know nothing about. I'm not a historian. Where you have gone deep into the history of stamps, I have maybe violated the history of stamps by creating by creating a business that uses stamps in an ahistorical and in a purely aesthetic and purely symbolic way to sort of connote authenticity and value in a different kind of postal system that is obviously completely unregulated, wholly entrepreneurial, focused on expression rather than so basically. So the way that we use stamps in our business is that we entered the market of a world where people use email to communicate with a product that was paid and that was focused on design and self-expression. And when we were trying to communicate what it was about the fact that our product was different, we relied heavily on this metaphor of an envelope and a card and a stamp. And what we found was that when we started charging, we didn't know how to charge our consumers for the product. So we went through a million different ideas of maybe we'll do a flat fee, it's $5 to send your birthday invitation, or maybe we'll do a subscription base where it's $20 a year to have all the stationery you want. And what we came upon when we really racked our brains, because investors told us, you really can't charge for this kind of product. Consumers don't want to pay for this kind of product. It doesn't make any sense. We thought, well, maybe the way to charge for this is to create the idea of a virtual stamp. And a virtual stamp will be something that consumers immediately understand. There's a long history of it. They're beautiful. They mean so much more. There's a depth of meaning to them that obviously goes beyond the surface value. And so that became the sort of the cornerstone of our business model. We became a company that sold virtual stamps. We were a postal system that sold virtual stamps as the unit of credit to deliver a message. So since then, we've really riffed on that a fair amount. We've created virtual stamps that are cause-based, like they do in the U.S., with stamps that are raise awareness for causes like breast cancer. We've used stamps as a way of giving people tools of self-expression, which is something that we find people actually like, and consumers enjoy in America also. When people get engaged, they want to use a stamp. They want to send their wedding invitation with a particular stamp that is particularly beautiful or has a sort of it's a way. There is a packaging element to and a design element to postage stamps, which you point out is nothing new. Although I think the variety has obviously grown, the variety of choice has grown, and the ability to make a statement with the stamp that you use is something that's probably a pretty new idea. But we take a meta approach to it, and I actually don't have too much to add that's substantive. But I am tickled to be here around someone who actually knows so much about stamps, and to hopefully provide some perspective from in this sort of a postmodern perspective on what stamps could mean in an age when the way that we deliver messages is changing. And just to add some color to that, to mention that with reference to this book, that my company is currently actually in conversations with the Royal Mail, which is now, I guess, being privatized.
Yes.
Right, and so and it started out like what you were saying with the pen. I mean, it started out private as well.
No, it always was a public thing. He was, when I say a social entrepreneur, I mean he worked through the government to get this institution called the Penny Post
from within
to happen. But he was, I mean, the very first post was very entrepreneurial. There was a guy called William Dockwra, who the first penny post was in 1682. Yeah, the gentleman nodding his head, he knows more about this than I do, probably. 1682 was the first penny post in London. And London was big. It was 500,000 people or something in 1682. It was probably the biggest city in the world at that time. And he had this, basically a postal system. He set out private. And it was so successful that the government then nationalised it several years later. But luckily, for Dockwra, the government nationalised it, and they gave it to the Duke of York, who then became king, who then became James II, who was then chased out of the country in the Glorious Revolution. So Dockwra got his company back again, and he carried on for a while. I'm not sure. I think, like a number of entrepreneurs, he sort of, in the end, ran out of money or something went wrong. But he was the great founder of this. So it was originally an entrepreneurial idea, and then penny posts started up in other cities. But Hill kind of had this overall conception, because the postal system was a bit of a joke beforehand. You had to go to the post office, and there'd be great scale. Oh, you want to send something to Aberystwyth? Oh, yes, that's 8p, and oh, it weighs this much, so it'll be a shilling. And this was, of course, a lot of money in those days. A workman might earn a shilling a week or something. And you didn't pay, it was payment on receipt, which is an incredibly inefficient system, of course, because half the time people aren't in, or they don't want to receive the letter, so it was a ludicrous system. And like many entrepreneurs, Hill turned the thing on its head and did something totally different. It's a very impressive piece of entrepreneurship, I think, but it is within the context of a government body rather than a business.
Interesting.
But the same skills, I think, that same skill set of this ability to see a totally different way of doing something and then to put it into practice and actually make it work, which is a really tough bit, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's. I think that I wouldn't compare myself to that, but I do think it's interesting to think about the fact that, now when we talk to the Royal Mail, we're speaking with people who are working with investors and who are thinking about it entrepreneurially again, and they're thinking about their future, and they're thinking that their future is actually, they see their future in parcel delivery rather than in in mail delivery, and it sort of ties back to what you were saying about the small scale and the large scale of this stamp as a symbol and as a historical document. It is a public thing, but it's traditionally it's what seals and delivers some of the most important messages that people have traditionally sent, and so they're concerned from a brand perspective, as they say, as sort of a company, about what it means for the Royal Mail if they're no longer delivering as much correspondence, and if they are becoming more of
parcels and other things. They've got to deliver lots of stuff, haven't they, in order to flourish.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to hear how this all works out and what you end up doing with them.
Thank you.
Do keep me posted and make a rather weak one, but that sounds very intriguing, actually. It's a great brand. It's a fantastic brand. It's since 1840, and tremendous. I say these wonderful iconic stamps. Wonderful people to work with. Are they nice to work with? Are you enjoying working with them?
Well, we have only been working with them sort of briefly, but they are nice so far.
Good.
Yeah, they're nice
Excellent.
so far.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
Do you think there are people would you?
Yes.
I think we're going to actually open it up to see if anybody in the audience has questions for Chris and yourself tonight. Is anybody interested? Casey.
I would be curious to hear you both talk about the design elements. Like if you have a favorite stamp, if you have a favorite stamp that yours is printed and yours is digital.
Well, here's my favourite is actually on the cover here. It's this 1 3d coronation from 1953 by the designer Edmund Dulac, who did lots of stamps. There's another one of his in this book, the Olympic Games one. Sadly, he never lived to see this stamp actually produced because he died in 1953, just before the coronation. But I just think this is an utterly beautiful stamp.
It is beautiful.
Now, of course, I mean, the whole question of aesthetics is a strange, almost philosophical business. Why is it beautiful? Who knows? It's just, ultimately, you just make a judgment, don't you? You look at things and you think, I like looking at that one more than I like looking at that one. That's perhaps not a very philosophical answer, but I think it's perhaps, I mean, it's very difficult to be philosophical about aesthetics. I think things either appeal or they don't. And I just think this is a lovely, lovely, lovely stamp. It's elegant. It's beautifully proportioned. It says exactly what he wanted to say. It's about the monarchy. It's got a pride to it, but it's also the Queen is looking straight at you, which hadn't really happened before. They're very nearly with Dulac. There's one of his stamps for the previous coronation, actually, of George VI and Queen Mary. They're sort of nearly looking at you, but not quite. But in this stamp, the Queen fixes you with her eyes.
Do you think when she goes back to profile in more recent stamps that it's like an archaizing sort of aesthetic?
Well, it's very interesting. This is a very odd thing about the whole thing about the monarch's profile, because they experimented before. With Queen Victoria, it was always absolute straight profile, as in the William Wyan design. And then when George V came to the throne, they experimented with a 3/4 profile. So he'd sort of been like that. He sort of half looked towards you. And people didn't like it. Now, it may have been, there were other things wrong with the stamps. They weren't very good. They weren't very well designed. There was a rather sort of mangy lion underneath him. It didn't exactly roar with imperial pride. And the whole thing was, so, I don't know, maybe, but I think people somehow, they didn't want the monarch to be too pally in those days, back in 1913 when these stamps came out. And so his head was turned back into profile again. And on the definitive stamps, it has always stayed that way. There's a difference between commemorative and definitive stamps. And the definitive ones are the ordinary things that you stick on a letter. The commemoratives are the special ones that come out for a particular occasion. They're only on sale for a short while. The definitive stamps had this little flirtation with a 3/4 profile in 1913. No, we're not going to do that. And they've been profile ever since. The commemoratives have... this is a very radical one, the Queen looking at us. There is, of course, there's a great hoo-ha about the Queen's head being on stamps at all. Back in the 1960s, Tony Benn, or Lord Viscount Stansgate, to give him his proper name, wanted to get rid of it altogether. He was a Republican, socialist. This was the sort of high point of the Labour government in the 1960s. Trendy, swinging 60s. Queen, let's get rid of the Queen's head. But this didn't go down very well. The Queen was not amused by this. Ben, it was the lovely description of Ben taking along some stamps to Buckingham Palace. to sort of get her all excited about these new stamps without her head on. And he laid them out on the floor, and he started with a set of racehorses because he thought the Queen would like that. And she sort of stood there and watched this and was not amused, and communicated her views to Mr. Wilson the next day. And then Ben was moved to Minister of Technology, I think, after that. And so yes, the Queen has always been in profile on definitive stamps, and certainly on most commemoratives now. She's in cameo also.
And is that the same if you look at official portraiture of these regents, like with the advent of photography in the late 1800s, and obviously not with Queen Elizabeth, but with her father? Is profile standard for portraiture, or is it really only for...
No, it is very much on stamps. It's a very interesting point. And coins. I mean, it started with coins. The original, the penny black itself, was based on a coin. It was designed by William Wyon in 1837 when Queen Victoria came to the throne. And it was minted in the City of London or something. Wyon designed, and that was in profile. I think it was very standard that coins were profile, and stamps took their lead from that.
Interesting.
But ordinary portraits, have always been face on. I mean, you think of the Holbein Henry VIII, there he is staring at you.
Yeah.
So I think it's an odd... It's a strange thing about stamps in a way, and that's why the Dulac thing is such a surprise to everyone. It's just, there she is looking at you.
Were there any interesting or notable stamps you were unable to include in the book?
Well, I'd say that I love the Festival of Britain, 1951, but there's enough about the 50s in there, so I just can't do that. So I just alluded to it. But they're great stamps, lovely modern design. They speak a lot about that era, but I just there wasn't enough space, really, unfortunately, because I do think they're very fine stamps.
Do you have all the stamps that are in the book in your personal collection?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yes, most of them are. Sadly, most of them are worth absolutely nothing. Is a reality. Most of the commemorative stamps that came out since the 60s have virtually no value at all, unless you get ones that are errors. And there's always a bit of fun to have. The great philatelists love errors. So heads nodding out there in the audience. If you collect stamps, you love an error. It's a great thing. There's if there's a colour missing, or of course the classic American one is this wonderful upside down aeroplane, the inverted Jenny, which is worth huge sums of money. I mean, $1 million or something. 'Cause not very many of them exist, and there are wonderful stories about how these things get people fight over them, and in the States they actually had to print a whole load of stamps with errors on them in order to bring the price down. So yes, that they can be valuable. There are errors of modern British stamps which are worth quite a lot of money, but most of the recent ones aren't. There has been this strange kind of philatelic inflation, whereby just loads of issues started pouring forth. And you were talking about postmodernism earlier on. There's a sense in which stamps have turned into collectibles rather than things you put on letters. And
there's entire philatelic societies dedicated all throughout the world in the United States that focus on that sort of aspect of stamps as well as the utilitarian.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's a kind of game in a sense that the deal is you collect these things which were used as practical things in life, but if they become pure collectibles, then they lose their initial point, and it's a very subtle thing. But there is a kind of downgrading, I think. And the most recent stamps I have in here is the royal wedding of the future king and his lovely wife. But the stamps came in... You couldn't just go to post office and say, I want one of those. You had to buy a special sheet with a little border around it and all that sort of thing, or you could buy a first aid cover, or you could buy a thing with a coin in it and all that sort of stuff. You couldn't go to post office, buy a stamp, lick it, stick it on them, put it in the box. It had become a collectible, and that's very strange.
And I think that's the sort of impulse and the sort of attraction that we are always playing on, for better or worse, when we're bringing stamps into our ecosystem.
You should play on it.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I think that is a real drive, and it's very relatable. I think, for us, they're not even collectibles. We just want to collect them as images. There was at one point we racked up a lot of legal fees talking with our IP lawyers about there was a collection of 30,000 stamps that I wanted to purchase for the company, that it was really impressive, and I thought, why can't I just digitize all of these and let people just sift through them and choose whichever one they want, and send the image of it on the image of an envelope, and have that be the experience for this kind of an modern mailing of using a stamp. And our lawyers were scratching their head, and we don't really think that that's going to be okay. We don't know. We've researched it, but there's not a lot out there about whether or not you can sell the image of a stamp, or so it was a bit of a gray area, and we never ended up moving forward.
No, I think you're kind of wise to just
to let it be. Yeah.
I think it's a difficult one. I mean, it was a bit of getting permission to do these stamps was quite a complex business. Because you have to get permission from the Royal Mail, and you have to get it from the designer as well, unless it's over 75 years old, in which case it's out of copyright, so that's fine. But it is a bit of a business. I think we were very wise to sort of stay clear of that minefield.
But I was tempted.
Yeah, sure. No, I can see that. I can see that.
Wonderful.
What do you use as the basis of design for your stamps?
Well, our stamps aren't actually very well. We don't actually. Our stamps are not really great pieces of design, but we do. But our logo. But we do have a variety of stamps which we use. We take it's sort of secondary product. We use artwork that we create for our cards, and then we will put them on a stamp, and we will put our main stamp, the stamp that is the default stamp on all of the envelopes that are mailed. And we send about 50. So this year we'll send 50 million invitations. So it's about 1 million a week. So it's 50 million envelopes going out to people's mailboxes, and the default stamp is actually a horizontal stamp that has our logo in it, which is a pigeon with a letter in its mouth. So just to take it to another level, but we are interested in stamp as sort of from the perspective of consumer packaging, and also symbols. And what we found, we find that people enjoy selecting a stamp for something they're using, something that they're sending. We also find that there's this movement, and there's a lot of demand for, which is customization of stamps. So there's a lot of money being made by people who are allowing brides and grooms to put their photo on a stamp, or put their monogram in a stamp. And I don't know where that impulse comes from, but people, that's people wanting to have their design fingerprint on a stamp, whereas traditionally you never had any say in what your stamp looked like.
I think that's an interesting sort of aspect of modern society, isn't it? Sort of more customization, doing your own thing, doing it your own way. I think the older generation, in a sense, wanted to key into something they perceived as being bigger than themselves through the stamp. So you sort of keyed into the nation. I don't know whether it was the King or George Washington or something on a stamp. There was a big fuss in the States in the 1860s when pictorial stamps were brought out. And there was instead of the George Washington being on the stamp, there was a picture, I think, of a railway engine or something. And people got terribly upset about this. They wanted George Washington on a stamp. And now it's sort of the other way around. People want themselves on the stamp. And what does that say about society? I don't know. It's just an interesting change, isn't it?
No one will collect those stamps, obviously.
No.
With my face on it, for instance, or my initials.
Your family might. I don't know.
Exactly.
Or if you become notorious, or for some reason. But no, that's true. That's true. But that's interesting. It does say a lot about the sort of the world we live in, I think.
When you said earlier, looking at the arc of the stamps, you could sort of see the arc of British Empire in terms of design, in terms of very detailed design, stepping back, sort of cleaner design. What theory would you come up with about why that?
I don't know. That's a very good question. Yeah, I think my guess is it's just because things just do ebb and flow. People get bored with something, and they want something different. I think the Victorians loved clutter, if you go to a Victorian museum or something, you will see clutter everywhere. The Victorians loved filling their rooms with stuff, and there's great big heavy curtains hanging over everything, and elephants' feet and dead stags on the wall, and all this sort of stuff everywhere. That's what the Victorians liked. And then you get the sort of the modernists, Bauhaus and all that sort of stuff, wanted to clean everything out, and nice, simple, clear lines. And then, but after the war, I think there was a sense people wanted, they were fed up with all this sort of violence, and they wanted something kind of rather homely. And the Dorothy Wilding stamps from the early Queen Elizabeth's reign are kind of rather sort of cute and homely. And modern critics hate them, but I think they're rather nice. And I think modern critics don't like them because they don't understand the mindset of the people at that time, who wanted a cottage with roses round the door, and this is a sort of philatelic equivalent of that. And I think that's nice. That's what people wanted. And but then again, people wanted to clear things up. Got this 1960s white heat of technology. Let's be modernising this, that, and the other. There's wonderful. It was awful actually. It was a guy called Barry Bucknell who did DIY programs on British television. And one of the things he'd do is you get a lovely, beautiful old door, and he said, "Oh, it's a horrible old door. I'm going to stick a bit of plasterboard over it," and they'd modernise it. So this beautiful old door would be turned into this great big sort of slab of MDF or something. And there was that sort of 60s, let's modernise things, make it clean and simple. And the Machin stamps, which came out in the early 70s, are a beautiful example of that. They're done very well. Lovely, simple, clear lines. Nowadays, I think we're getting more elaborate again. People want a little bit more fuss about things, but it just comes and goes. Quite why, I think, is a mystery. There is an element, I think, of just things going from one pendulum to another. People get bored. One generation wants to be different to the generation before, so they reconsider things. It's an interesting question, and it does say a lot about society, I think.
Did we have any other audience questions out there this evening?
Sir?
There's a comment. You were talking about collectibles. I think in the U.S. that we really got it started. Our post office has always been close to bankruptcy, as long as I can remember. And one way to sort of jumpstart their problem is the Elvis stamp, the Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that really came under real disdain by American collectors who just thought this is the end of civilization. And some of them stopped collecting.
Really? Right.
Next thing
Yeah.
you had folks buying it.
No, sure, absolutely.
And they just said it's no longer serious.
No, I can kind of understand that in a way. I mean, since the Apollo moon missions, I think there have been more stamps with Disney characters on than there have been celebrating the Apollo mission. It is rather strange. But of course, I mean, the US has been producing lots and lots of special stamps for a long time. I mean, Roosevelt was a great believer in the power of the stamp as a communicative tool. And it's a long time before. In Britain, we had a go. We had the Silver Jubilee stamp, which is on there, was an attempt round about the same time of using the stamp as a way of sort of producing a more modern image of the post office and of the country generally. But it's nothing compared to what FDR did, who was, of course, a great philatelist himself and understood the medium very well. And yes, then along came Elvis. But that's a very popular stamp. I mean, it's often voted the most popular stamp, isn't it? Whether it will be in 20 years' time, I don't know. There's people of our age, my age anyhow, who remember him first time round and just think it's fun, but who knows?
The question I have, I'm not a real purist. I collect first day covers.
Ah, yes.
And I've always been curious why, in the United States, it's always been the private sector. Private companies have always produced covers.
Yeah.
Some of them are very nice.
Yeah.
Real beautiful artwork, cachets.
Yes, cachets, yeah.
And some of them are spurious and aren't as spurious. England, most European companies, most European countries, it's controlled by the government. Like England,
Yeah.
The Post puts out their covers.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, the United States never, Postal Service never had anything to do with first state.
That's very
I'm just
interesting.
curious why in England and other European countries the government controlled the issues of
And maybe that says rather a lot about the differences between the two ways of being in the world, I think. I mean, I just think, America is a much more private enterprise-oriented culture than Europe.
Although the governments in Europe put them out, some of them put out a very nice cover.
Oh yes, no, they've done a very good job. Very good job. There are private firms in Britain that do this, because you can get first day covers issued by private firms, but somehow or other the official post office ones have a bit more cachet. That's sort of another weak pun, really. But I mean, there's something a bit special about them.
But England has always, which I've always liked, they've always, I don't want to use the word stayed, but they've always relied on history.
Yes, absolutely.
Which I've always liked. Whereas some of the other countries in Europe, it's sort of gone, maybe in our vein, it's sort of gone.
Yes, I think the British stamps have always kept one eye on the past. I mean, again, that's very much the sort of the British way, I think, is to have sort of history in the background.
Maybe we just don't have as much of it also.
That's right.
You've got quite a lot. You've
No,
got
we
quite
do,
a lot.
yeah.
So-
You mentioned, the idea of entrepreneurs. The first stamps in this country in the 1840s, before 1847, when the government got its own stamps, were issued by private companies. There were entrepreneurs who ran city posts in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and places like that. And also express companies that sent the mail internationally, because of the Universal Postal Union, sending your letter to South America or somewhere was a dicey affair. You had to find somebody to take it there for you, because there was no international mail. And there were private companies that put out their own stamps. And most of them were very crude and ugly, and were copied extensively before they left the market, so it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
But if you were to do a version of this book, The History of the United States, in 36 Postage Stamps, it would have a lot of the private couriers and express companies in there, because they really tell the story of the 19th century and how the U.S. expanded.
That's interesting. I am doing this book as we sit here, actually, for Stephen. So, tell me, actually, I'm very intrigued. You'd obviously know a lot about this, much more than I do. So, I mean, these postmasters provisionals one hears of. I mean, are they?
Another category again. That was
Okay.
Postmasters.
Because they were sort of they were governmental, weren't they?
They were governmental, but they fell into two categories. There were the ones before the U.S. put out its own stamps in the 1840s, where
Yeah.
the local postmasters basically said, look, we need stamps because they have them in places like England, Brazil even. We need our own. So they started doing it. Then during the Civil War, when the federal government cut off the South and said, if you have any stamps left in your post offices, forget about you. They're not good anymore. But the South, the Confederate States, had invented their own, and so the local postmasters across the South had to invent their own. Some of them were beautiful. But those are quasi-official.
Okay, so you've got three levels then. There's the official thing starting in 1847 with the Washington and the Franklin. Then you've got these postmasters provisionals. And then there are these other private ones, which I must say I didn't know very much about.
I'd be happy to send you some information.
I'm very grateful.
Fascinating.
They sound it. I'll give you my card. That sounds fantastic. That'd be lovely. Really interested to hear about that.
How long have you worked for?
I leave tomorrow morning, unfortunately, on a train to Boston, which is a real shame.
We'll stay in touch. I'll
Yeah, no, that'd be brilliant. I'd love that.
I've read your book, and I find it quite fascinating.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I have the English edition, which came out
Ah, right.
a couple years ago.
Yes.
Which I got online through the British Post Office.
All right. Oh, excellent.
The Postal Museum.
Yes, the Postal Museum. Yes, I gave a talk there, and they sold some books, and they did a sort of offer. Brilliant.
Nice to see it come out here.
Lovely. Well,
I think it's fascinating.
so am I.
Wonderful. We're coming down to the end of our time for the evening. Thank you so much, James and Chris, for joining us. Thank you all for being here as well. Make sure, if you haven't already, to check out a copy of The History of Britain in 36 Postage Stamps. Take care.
Thank you
you.
very much for having us along.
Thanks so much.